last 3 or 4 years, we've been running a giant natural experiment. That natural experiment involves the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom in the middle. And if it wasn't for the sequester that's going on in the United States at the moment, the IMF and the CBO in the United States estimates US growth would be between 2.8 and 3.1%. Now, they haven't managed to cut except for the sequester procedure. So first, to do no harm. De-lever your banking system, recapitalize, growth starts to return. Economies actually do have wonderful self-healing properties on some occasion. Now, Britain has all those advantages, including its own currency, but it decided to tighten the screws itself. Its deficit, rather than the 3% that the Americans are heading for in a stabilization of growth, is actually now leading to more debt and a deficit of around 5.6% for the end of the year. Periphery Europe, where they've tightened most of all, have managed to lose 20% of GDP throughout the periphery, have generated 22 million above-term unemployment, altered their entire long-term GDP track in the process, has basically dug themselves a hole that will take them 10 years to get out of, and they have more debt right across the board rather than less, and their deficits are in double figures. Every commission target for the deficits gets kicked down the road like everything else, and the screws continue to tighten. Point number one, it simply doesn't work. Now, why doesn't it work? Because there's a deep fallacy of composition at work here. When everybody who's everyone else's trading partners, who all share a currency, none of them can print, all simultaneously contract, the denominator shrinks and the numerator increases. So a constant stock of debt on a shrinking economy, particularly on the zero bound, hurts. As the IMF reports from 2012 onwards show, there's an extreme negative convexity in the negative multipliers, whereby in the periphery between $1.5 and $1.7 is lost for every dollar that's cut. That's why Greece and Spain and Italy all have more debt rather than less, and the ones who have cut the most have the largest negative convexities and the largest increases in growth because of austerity. What's really annoying about all of this is the fact that we forget why it started, which is what I like to call the class-specific put option on the global taxpayer. Because back in 2008, I don't remember too many American senators jumping up and down and screaming about the crazy amount of debt in the United States. There at that time was 61%. And we managed to get there because of 2 wars of choice without raising taxes and a bunch of tax cuts that there was no corresponding offsetting spending cuts. So basically have 61%. And then suddenly it's up to 90. What happened in 2008? Do you remember that? Yeah, that was that thing called the bailout of the global financial system, whereby through recapitalization, needed stimulus programs across the board, and most of all, lost tax revenue from these behemoths banks blowing up. All of the public balance sheets that we see became much, much more contaminated with debt. Yes, it ended up as public debt, but it was really the socialization of private debt, working through the credit channels that ended up in the public's balance sheet, saving the banks. So those people who made out, basically, with most of the income growth over the past 25 years, who have the most assets and the most income, got their assets and income bailed and reinsured, and the cost of doing so was then passed down the income distribution to everybody else for them to pay in the restriction of government and other public services. It is, in terms of politics, invidious, to say the least. Now, what was meant to solve all this was a wonderful thing called the confidence fairy. And the basic idea behind this one, when you follow it through in the technical papers, is the following. Despite the economy falling around your ears, not knowing if you'll have a house next week or whether your spouse will still have a job, you lie awake at night worrying about public debt. It's the number one thing you care about. So you monitor this closely, because it's really quite terrifying, and you watch those spreads, you think they're terrible things. And what you really want to see is firm action by the government to cut public spending, because using your rational expectations and a wonderful trick called Ricardian equivalence, you then channel out 20 years ahead, calculating or recalculating your lifetime income. And you now know that because the welfare state will be smaller 20 years out, you'll have less taxes to pay right now. That inspires confidence. I run out to IKEA, buy a new couch, and end the recession. If that sounds ludicrous, I can assure you that is exactly what the argument is. There are no confidence fairies. Now, the other thing is, what I found just doing the book, there are no positive cases of this ever working. None. Now, I get pulled up in the FT about this, and this is why I'm called a polemicist. But it's not true that there are any positive cases. All cases of fiscal consolidation happen when the economy is growing. Of the cases in the 1980s, most highlighted, Canada, Denmark, Sweden, Australia, All of them happen to be small open economies where most of the heavy lifting was done by a devaluation of their own currency and then import inflation not appealing in the economy because of wage control agreements. There are zero cases of countries in recessions, particularly who are each other's trading partners, sharing a currency none of them actually control, managing to pull off a simultaneous contraction and grow at the same time. And the evidence for this is now in. Now, why did we do this? Because it simply wasn't needed, let alone the fact that it wasn't working. So the idea, of course, the markets were craving these huge yields because of the risk. Well, risks come in different flavors, and what they were actually pricing in was breakup risk. There's a big difference between the United States and the EU. One of them is a country, the other one isn't. And what that means is one of them has citizens, which is the fiat money economy's credible commitment to tax intergenerationally. I know that my kids in the US will be paying off federal debt accumulated today. But the EU has two big problems. Number one, it has a fake central bank. It's basically a currency board with a liquidity pump. It can't socialize, it can't asset swap, it can't mutualize, it can't even directly bail out banks, despite what the banking union is mooted to do the next time this happens. So given all this, the markets are pricing in breakup risk because they know that ultimately David Cameron is not going to hand over the British taxpayer to bail out the French banking system. Now, how do we know that this is actually true? We know this is true because the yields go all the way up until there's a program announced called LTRO1. And then there's LTRO2. And then there's ELA, Emergency Liquidity Assistance. And then there's the, oh my God, the OMT. So what actually cures the yield spread problem and brings this down isn't austerity, because austerity has destroyed 20% of Eurozone GDP in the periphery and created 22 million unemployed. That's not a good thing, even for people who buy sovereign debt. What they were counting on was a credible central bank policy for dealing with breakup risk. They got it. Almost. Mario's trying to give us the rest of it. Whether he gets there or not depends on people who live in Northern Europe. Which brings me to Germany, because Germany occupies an interesting place in this one. Germany is not the United States. Germany isn't big enough to liquidate the problem. So you have a banking system which is 3 times the size in terms of asset footprint and twice as levered as the US. You don't have a central bank like the Fed that can reach in, pull out all the toxic assets, add liquidity, force a recapitalization and get growth started, because Germany isn't big enough to flush the cistern. So I understand completely why they want austerity for everyone else, because neither their own business model, which is predicated on cost control and wages and exports, nor their banking system is big enough and strong enough to pull the rest of them out of the mess that they've dug for themselves. So if we remember this in closing, I think the case for austerity falls apart. Number one, it doesn't work. Number two, it cannot work. Number three, it hasn't worked. And number four, it's not going to work.
Thank you. I think there are so many points of what you said, we could debate 5 hours about that already. So I'm afraid I will have to let quite a few of these things stand. With one exception, let me say on break-up risk, I 90% agree with you on what you said on that, and we may come to that further in the discussion. Austerity, virtue or vice, I'm not sure which position I would actually take. I think it's neither a virtue nor a vice, but it can be necessary. It's like a good diet. You need to live within your means. If you haven't lived within your means, but well beyond your means, there is no way around it. Eventually, you have to get back to live within your means. If you call that austerity, it's not a virtue. It's just you have to get back to be sustainable. The being sustainable is the virtue, not the diet that makes you get back to live within your means. And if you're living beyond your means, what's the alternative? Live beyond your means forever, like Japan is trying to do? Look at them. They've tried to postpone seriously addressing their problems for 20 years, and what have they got to show for it? A really, really, really big public debt problem. And over here in the UK, well, yeah, this country has lived beyond its means for quite a while, from about 1998 to 2010. What does it have to show for it? A major rise in public debt. Talking about austerity, if I look at the numbers, what is austerity actually? It's trying to cut the underlying budget deficit. If I look at where the budget deficits stand today in the Western world, I find that in the UK, in the US, and Japan, the deficits are still, adjusted for the business cycle, far higher than they were in 2007. So to some extent, what you can say, the austerity that we've recently seen in the UK and a few other places was just taking back the stimulus that countries granted themselves in 2008, 2009 in response to a big recession. This, unfortunately, isn't yet quite austerity. All these countries, the US, the UK, Japan, are still living well beyond their means, to which a state to which they got accustomed in the years of the credit-fueled boom of the previous decade. The one region where the fiscal position, the underlying fiscal position, is roughly comparable to what it was in 2007 is the Eurozone. Net, there has not been any serious austerity in the Eurozone as a whole. What there has been is a fiscal stimulus, a very modest one post-Lehman, that has been taken back afterwards. If I look at individual places, it is true Greece has had savage austerity. And in my view, Greece has had too much austerity. Like a diet, if you overdo the diet, you're in trouble. And Greece has been asked to overdo the diet, which doesn't mean you should never go on a diet. No, you should live healthier, eat healthier. But you should not simply stop almost all eating, even if you had a serious problem. Austerity, to use a slightly different metaphor, is a medicine. Sometimes you have to take it. But of course, taking an overdose of it doesn't help. So there is indeed a clear case, again, overdoing the austerity, which isn't the same as saying that you should be living beyond your means forever. Much more important, however, than the austerity, that is simply getting back to living with what you can afford in the long run, is the taking exercise, changing your lifestyle. As economists, we call that structural reforms, which is a lot of that is happening across the Eurozone. The OECD, that's the club of the developed countries in Paris, has a list of countries, checks every year, who is actually doing structural reforms. Number one for the last 2 years has been Greece. Number two, Ireland. Then come Estonia, Portugal, and Spain. All the 4 countries in the Eurozone that have received some external assistance so far, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, are leaders in structural reforms. Beyond austerity, which in Greece is overdone, in other places less overdone, beyond austerity, they're actually doing a lot to get fit. Now, let me take a somewhat broader historical perspective. I had the pleasure of living in this country as a student in 1980, 81. What did I see? Major pain in the country because Maggie Thatcher was getting serious about slashing inflation and reforming the labor market. The initial results of Margaret Thatcher were record unemployment, mass protests on the street, and howls by almost all economists at the LSE and a few other places that please, she should change course. History has proven her right. It was painful, but it worked. If I remember my own country 10 years ago, Germany was the sick man of Europe. By far the worst economic performance, jointly with Switzerland, of all major developed countries. It had lived beyond its means with unification. Then Germany did labor market reforms and some modest austerity. The initial results were record unemployment, mass protests on the street for years. History has proven Germany right. Contrary to the advice dished out by most international economists that Germany should spend its way out of its disastrous performance in growth, Germany did not spend its way out of it. It went on a better diet and did a lot of exercise. The results are there by now to see for everybody. Germany and Switzerland are now among the strongest economies in Europe. They do show that reforms, structural reforms, and if need be, some cutting back of the state, do show spectacular results, but unfortunately with a lag. That at the moment, we have record unemployment in the Eurozone periphery, and protests. It's just what we had in this country in the early 1980s and what we had in Germany 2004 to 2006. It is painful, I know. It's a painful medicine. But it doesn't mean that the medicine doesn't work. Again, the medicine has been overdone in the case of Greece. And I think the program ought to be adjusted and is being adjusted. But it does not mean that the medicine as a whole is wrong. The alternative to Correcting living beyond your means is not to go on living beyond your means and wait for somebody else to pay for it. That is not going to work anywhere. Ultimately, coming to the Eurozone again. As much as we talk about the Eurozone debt crisis, the place in the Western world which by far the smallest increase in public debt since the start of the euro is the Eurozone. 20% increase in public debt to GDP over the last 13, 14 years. In the UK and the US, this increase is 45% of GDP. In Japan, it's triple digit. So all in all, whatever you want to say about the Eurozone, the region is not that bad in that. The underlying fiscal position in the Eurozone is largely sustainable now. The small countries are in a painful adjustment process. Political will is being strained, as it was in the UK ahead of the Falklands War. But it doesn't mean it's going to end in tears, it might. The recent indicators are that Greece, if we leave it in peace, that is, if we don't ask it to swallow more of the medicine of which it had swallowed enough, austerity, the recent indicators are that Greece, the Greek economy, will start to grow from the middle of this year onwards, helped by a rebound in business confidence, which in Greece is now above the Eurozone average, coming out from very deep, and of course a strong tourist season as well. The rain over here, I must say, does help tourist bookings in Greece a lot. Chances are, if we leave Greece in peace, that is, the Troika doesn't get overactive and the government in Greece holds up, that a year from now, Greece will be added to the list of countries which have, like the Baltics, like many others, like Britain under Thatcher, Germany under Schröder, that Greece can be added to the list of countries which have come through hard times and have the results to show for it, namely better results.